I am Gail Carberry, president of Quinsigamond Community College, and it's always my pleasure to welcome people to our campus. We thank you for choosing Quinsigamond as a site for this important conversation. Quinsigamond is one of 15 community colleges in the Massachusetts Community College system. We serve the greater Worcester area from just about the Princeton, Sterling area, maybe a little higher, straight on down to the Connecticut and Rhode Island area and across as far as Brimfield. We go as far east as the Marlborough area, and we have campuses located both here and in Southbridge and in 5 other satellites throughout central Massachusetts. We are the fastest growing community college in Massachusetts for our size, those being under 10,000. Last year we enrolled 9,100 and a few more students. We've grown 55% in just the last 6 years. So the success of casinos in Massachusetts, given the way the law has been written, where a portion of funds will support educational institutions such as Quinsigamond Community College, is not lost on us. It's clearly important to us that this industry succeed in Massachusetts. It's important for jobs, and it's important for revenue. And I want you to know that the 15 community colleges have come together and working with an outside group from Atlantic City that has a strong track record in training for casinos. We're ready to prepare a workforce to support the industries of the casino and gaming side. So I want to again thank you for being here. I'm also honored to be able to introduce a longstanding friend and respected colleague who has recently been appointed to the Casino Commission. Bruce Stebbins and I go back to a point in time when he chaired the Board of Trustees at Quinsigamond Community College, and I was on the executive team there. So he and I have worked well on a number of interesting projects, and I hope that he will continue to stay in touch with the community colleges from that side of his experience as this particular initiative gets listed. But let me give you a few points about Bruce. He is a native of Western Massachusetts, and most recently has served as Business Development Administrator for the City of Springfield. He also served 2 terms on the Springfield City Council from 2006 through the end of 2009. Prior to joining the city's Economic Development Office, Bruce served as Senior Regional Manager for the National Association of Manufacturers in the New England region from 1999 through 2010. Earlier in his career, Bruce served as in the administrations of both Governors Weld and Paul Cellucci, and was eventually promoted to the head of the Massachusetts Office of Business Development after serving as Deputy Director and Regional Director. His government experience included working in the Office of Political Affairs at the White House for President George H.W. Bush. His commitment to his community has also included serving on elected school committee in East Long Meadow for 7 years, and chairmanship, of course, of the Board of Trustees at Springfield Technical Community College, as well as other nonprofit community organizations. He's a graduate of the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science. So without further ado.
Thank you and good morning. On behalf of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, I want to thank President Gail Carberry and her team here at Quinsigamond Community College, the Dale Allen, the technical crew that's been running around here this morning to help us host this meeting this morning. Their support is greatly appreciated. Secondly, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning, and to our panelists for their commitment of time to discuss some of the pressing issues and questions before this commission. As a reminder, this education forum is similar to the one that we hosted in Boston back in early May, and 2 additional forums that we have coming up with respect to community mitigation as well as problem gambling are being held so that you, the public, can hear the same information we are as the Commission begins to build its organizational structure. Today's forum is to assist the Commission with learning about the New England gaming market in light of the bill's final passage late last year, what has changed since several of the key studies you're going to hear about this morning were published, and what information should we focus on as we begin the application process. Secondly, the Commission is looking to understand what resources we need to effectively and fairly evaluate the information that will be forthcoming from a gaming license applicant with respect to the information they will provide. How can we assess the validity of their economic impact and make any revenue projections? Finally, this Commission is required to conduct some baseline research defined as social and economic impact research. Since we have a unique opportunity to establish some landmark research results to help us understand the policy and economic impacts of gaming in the years ahead, what information is key to measuring our success in creating a vibrant gaming industry, create jobs, generate revenue, as well as minimize some of the unintended consequences. These two panels, the first panel here this morning, bring together the architects of the key studies that were the impetus behind the bill's passage, as well as additional policy and academic experts to help us answer these questions. I do want to note that our interest in gaming input on this topic is not limited to this one forum. Certainly there are comments and feedback that we would welcome that you can easily send to the Commission via our website, mass.gov/gaming. In addition, there were some speakers and experts who were interested in talking to the Commission at this forum, but whose schedule did not allow them to join us. We are going to invite them to join us at our regular weekly Tuesday business meetings in the weeks ahead. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the first panel, Steve Norton, who's the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Center for Public Policy. Steve.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity to facilitate this panel, and thank you for the nameplate. We've got a great panel here. I'm just going to introduce them briefly and get out of the way. To my left is Clyde Barrow, who has done a significant amount of work understanding the markets for gambling in the Northeast. And sitting next to him are three gentlemen who were the architects of studies that helped inform the legislative process that resulted in the expansion of gambling in Massachusetts. Michael Pollack from Spectrum Group, Carl, who produced a report for the Boston Chamber of Commerce on the implications of casino gambling in Massachusetts, and then Steve also from the Innovation Group, who has done extensive work in evaluating expanding gambling across the country. So with that, I'm going to step aside and allow Clyde to jump up, and we'll run through each of the presentations and then give the commissioners an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And I'll let you find to start this from the beginning there.
My presentation will probably be a little bit different than the other three because, as was pointed out, they actually authored several of the studies that informed the thinking of the governor, the House, and the Senate. I wanted to address head-on an issue that I've been asked to address several times over the last 2 or 3 weeks. It seems that every day I get a phone call from another media outlet addressing this thing called saturation. And one of the things that puzzles me about those questions is that each one who calls me assumes that saturation is a problem, by which they mean, is there actually a demand for 3 resort casinos and a slot parlor in Massachusetts? Although I can assure you the legislature and the governor did examine that question quite extensively over the last 5 years. I just wanted to briefly take my opportunity to address this particular issue. First, when I talk about casinos, you'll notice I talk about the casino industry, and I do that for a very specific reason. We all know by this point that it's been a very lengthy debate in Massachusetts, a heated and controversial debate, and one of the things I like to do is, to any extent that we can calm that debate, is back up and say, wait a minute, this is an industry. because there are a lot of things that get discussed as if they were somehow peculiar to the casino industry, when in fact most of the issues that we face are very similar to any other large-scale economic development, whether it be traffic, water and sewer, police and fire protection, transportation improvements, and so forth. And so really, just to give you the example, you may know that the U.S. federal government maintains the North American Industrial Classification System, where every business enterprise in the country is assigned a 6-digit code. And the government uses that for purposes of tracking the number of establishments, total employment, and total wages paid in various industries in the United States. Now, as you can see, that casinos, or gambling, actually has its own code, subsector 713, and it's right there along 11 and 12 with performing arts, spectator sports, and museums. And you might ask yourself, what could a casino possibly have in common with the New England Patriots or the Boston Museum of Science? And if you actually go read the classification manual, their answer to that is that they all produce a thing called entertainment or recreation, an intangible service for which you pay, and when you leave, what you leave with is hopefully a feeling of excitement or awe, or as my friend who paid $2,400 for a Super Bowl tickets learned, a considerable amount of disappointment if your team loses. So if we start from that perspective, that it's a business, I think we can then start to address these issues from that perspective. Now, the casino industry, in terms of Class 3 gaming right now in the United States, 34 states have Class 3 gaming. It will be 36 with Ohio and Massachusetts. Has gross gaming revenues of over $62 billion per year. That includes both commercial and Indian casinos. $75 billion in total revenues if you include the non-gaming amenities such as hotels. And it employs over 640,000 people in the United States as of 2011. So as you can see, it is a big industry, to say the least. Now, a lot of attention has been focused, of course, on declining revenues in Atlantic City, the declining revenues on the Las Vegas Strip, and it's certainly the first time that the casino industry suffered a downturn in the recession that we now know as the Great Recession. But paradoxically, it was a time when there was a lot of activity going on in the Northeast. If we start the recession, which it did begin in 2007, during that period, West Virginia added table games at its 4 racetrack casinos. Delaware authorized table games at its 3 racetrack casinos, as well as a sports lottery. Pennsylvania opened 9 slot parlors during that period and then added table games. Rhode Island went 24 hours. Maryland opened a racetrack casino, which is now 2. And New York added 3 more casinos, including Empire City, which is the largest racetrack casino in the United States today in terms of gaming positions. And even since that time, we've seen Resorts World open in Queens, the Revel open in Atlantic City. That's a picture of it in the corner. Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, the Horseshoe in Cleveland, and Oxford Casino in Maine. So there has been an enormous amount of expansion right through the recession and its aftermath, which my estimate's about $3.4 billion in new capital investment in the Northeast in the industry during that period of time. But of course, what that's led to is a map which looks like this, which, as you can see, there are a lot of gaming venues in the Northeast, although, as you can see, there's this kind of blank spot right there, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. But when people look at this map, a lot of them say, can there possibly be demand for any more casinos? Surely the market is saturated. Well, first of all, I want to ask, what does saturation mean? Well, according to the Dictionary of Economics, it's the point of a product life cycle when the market has been completely filled so that no more sales for goods and services can be taken up. Another word for that in economics is equilibrium, when all of the demand for a particular good or service has been met by the existing supply. And so some people have been asking the question, is there any unmet demand that Massachusetts could possibly satisfy that would justify the building of these 3 resort casinos and a slot parlor? Well, the first way to address that is how many casinos is too many. And the first thing I want to point out to you, I know you probably can't read this slide, it's pretty small, but the sheer number of casinos in itself is not the issue. You can divide up the market in a lot of ways, and there are some states that choose to go with smaller venues and other states that go with much larger ones. But if you were to look at South Dakota, it has 35 casinos. Mississippi has 30 casinos. Iowa, 18 casinos. Louisiana, 18 casinos. Missouri, 12. Indiana, 13. So there are clearly states with comparable populations or even much smaller populations that have a large number of casinos in them. So it always puzzles me when we agonize over, is 3 too many? Now, another way to look at that then, as I said, is you can break that market up in a lot of different ways. So then you ask yourself, well, how do we distribute these slot machines around the different facilities? And one of the ways we look at this is the per capita population per number of slot machines. And this is just sort of a sampling of markets where we've looked at the population age 21 plus by select markets. And as you can see, sort of going across the middle of that chart, places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Missouri, Colorado, Indiana, Minnesota, anywhere from about 200 to 250 adults per slot machine in those markets. And where they have both Indian and commercial casinos, we have combined those numbers to measure the total number of slot machines in that particular market. In New England right now, we have 537 adult residents per slot machine within the existing market, which means clearly we have people there in much larger numbers than we do in other markets. If we add machines, our estimate is that falls to about 377 adults per slot machine, but that's still well above what you find in existing markets, which it may surprise you to know that in Indiana they generate over $2 billion per year in gross gaming revenues right now, a small farm state. So clearly there's the population to support the level of machines that we're talking about. And this estimate, of course, assumes that Connecticut and Rhode Island will probably reduce their number of machines as they lose business that gets redistributed to Massachusetts. It also includes the new casino that just opened in Maine, and we incorporate its expansion into that estimate. And we're taking essentially an estimate that there would be 10,000 slot machines in Massachusetts. That could go up or down a little bit depending on the operators. But clearly, we're not out of line with other markets in terms of the number of machines that are being proposed by the existing competitors. Now, Massachusetts is also in a somewhat unique place within the context of the New England market. First of all, it's where the people live. We are almost half the population of New England, and if you look at this map, obviously the darker the blue, the more densely concentrated the population, and essentially you can see that area around Boston, the 495 loop, is the most densely concentrated part of New England other than the I-84 strip running from Hartford to Stamford, Connecticut. So this is where the people live, and not coincidentally, it's also where the money is. If you look at the distribution of disposable personal income and how it's concentrated, you can see the dark areas there concentrated in that loop around 495, a very dense concentration of income, the most dense concentration of disposable income in New England. In fact, some of my testimony in New Hampshire, I referred to it as the Comstock load of New England gaming, that there is money there to be spent. Now, how much money is there to be spent? Well, this is sort of a very simplified gravity model, if you will, though we would do it in much greater detail if we were doing it for a particular facility. But if you look at disposable personal income and the propensity to gamble in New England right now, you can see that in New England there is $641 billion in disposable personal income, and that number increases by 3 to 5% every year. So we're adding upwards of $18 billion a year in new disposable income every year, and that largely held true through the recession as well. Massachusetts alone, over $300 billion. We account for 48% of all of the disposable income in the New England region. And if you look at what percentage of money people spend just on casino gambling, nationally, last year, residents spent about 0.5%, 0.53% of their disposable personal income on casino gambling. Doesn't include other forms of gambling. And as you look at the different, and that's down from 0.0061 throughout most of the 2000s during the economic recovery, so it's a flexible number. So if we use 0.53, 0.5%, that's a recessionary level of spending on casino gambling. But you can also see, and the reason I've ordered the states of New England in this way, is you can see that the closer you get to a casino, the higher that percentage goes. In Rhode Island, it's almost 1% of disposable personal income, and that's down from 1.4% in 2006. In Connecticut, it's about at the national average. Massachusetts, half the national average, and so forth as we go down through Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. The further you get, obviously, the less available a product, the less you will spend on it. So how would that translate into a New England gaming market? Well, if we use the recessionary number for your wager, 0.00532, it generates an estimated gaming market of about $3.4 billion just in New England, not counting what might be drawn from tourists or New York or other places. If we subtract from that what is already going to be captured by Maine, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, that would leave an unmet demand of about $1.1 billion for Massachusetts. However, we also know that we're going to recapture some of what Massachusetts residents spend in Connecticut and Rhode Island right now. Our survey research indicates that 67% of the state's gamblers tell us they will repatriate that money within the first year of opening casinos in Massachusetts. We've used a much more conservative number of 60%. We know that we will recapture traffic that is leaving Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire because these are closer to them, and we know that gamblers prefer the closest comparable casino. I'm going to argue that we're going to capture new traffic from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York for a couple of reasons. Hartford is closer to Palmer than it is to Mohegan Sun, and 77% of adults in New England do not smoke. And we're going to have the only 100% non-smoking casinos in New England, and I'm going to argue that's going to be a positive for this market that will attract people given that opportunity. That gives us a demand of $1.8 billion. If we capture even a few tourists, I'm going to say 250,000 spending an average amount, that's going to add to the market, and we're a state that generates millions of tourist visits every year. So the demand, in my view, could go as high as $2 billion. If it returns to 0.61, as it was during most of the 2000s, it could go as high as 2.6, 2.7 billion as we build these out over the next 3 to 5 years. So I think there's plenty of market demand to support the types of facilities that were proposed in the legislation. And they're going to end it by responding to one thing, because somebody's going to say, well, yeah, but you're a professor, and Sheldon Adelson said there's not enough demand to support casinos, and surely he knows more about that than you. But actually, that's not what Sheldon Adelson said. And if I quote him, as he was quoted in the newspapers, both here and in Las Vegas, what he said was that the state's plan to license 3 casinos and a slot parlor would dilute the market, and that it was the multiple facilities didn't sync with his business model. Well, first, dilution is a different financial concept than saturation. It refers to the amount of income that each equity holder would receive, and obviously, the more facilities you have, the less income you're going to generate for that particular stakeholder. But what is his business model? Well, not counting the casinos he's already built, just looking at the ones that are developing right now, they're spending $4.4 billion in the Central Cotai development in Macau. $20 to $35 billion to create essentially the Atlantic City of the Mediterranean. $4 billion in New York City, potentially. They're talking about $3 billion in Miami. So obviously, if you're going to build a facility of that magnitude, you would need a monopoly over the state of Massachusetts, which is exactly what he said to the legislature as I was sitting 3 feet from him in March of 2007. In other words, it's not that there isn't demand, it's that there isn't sufficient demand to justify a $3 billion facility unless you have a monopoly on the Massachusetts market, which we chose not to do. And by comparison, as you can see, based on the current proposals, the mandatory minimum in Massachusetts would be $1.6 billion in investment divided among the 4 facilities combined. Given the current proposals, it might go as high as $2.3 billion, but even all 4 facilities combined wouldn't be equal to the smallest thing being considered by Sheldon Adelson at the current time. So what he then said is like, there's just not enough to justify a 20% return on the money we need to build the kind of integrated resort we're specialists at. So I would just caution you, that's what Sheldon really said. Thank you.
Is that you?
That's it. Just go to view slideshow. Thank you, Steve. And it's nice to follow Clyde. I've got a lot of experience doing that. I'm Mike Pollack, Managing Director of Spectrum Gaming Group, and I do want to state from the outset that we are currently engaged by the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. We're also engaged by the Massachusetts State Lottery Commission. Most of our work is for government. We do research with respect to gaming. We're not pro-gaming, we're not anti-gaming. We simply do research that focuses on gaming. Does that mean we do not have a bias? I think if we had a bias, it would be, we would consider ourselves to be pro-regulation, pro-effective regulation, because in our experience, that makes all the difference. Now, we did work in 2008 for the governor's office, and we followed that up in 2010 doing work for the legislature. And this slide essentially shows where we were in 2010, which was an update of our 2008 study. And what we did in both of those studies to avoid any appearance of favoring any potential applicant over another was to take the three regions as defined, take the geographic center of each one, and assume a destination casino in each of those. Now, I do want to point out one essential difference between 2008, 2010, and where we are in 2012 is that we did not anticipate, nor did we model in a Class II slots facility into this. This is 3 destination casinos as Class I facilities. What these lines show, I don't know how clearly you can distinguish them, but they are 2-hour drive times from these hypothetical facilities, and you can see some significant overlap in those drive times. So what we compared our 2008, 2010, and essentially adjusted for inflation and put them all in, at this time, $2010 to get apples to apples. Bear in mind, when we did our projections, we do not take, nor would we suggest anyone take, the first year revenue as what we're looking at. We look at what we term year 3. So the third year of a casino's operation, which is the year in which they've effectively ramped up their marketing, they've got their database in place, they know who their customers are, and it's a much more reliable measure as to what they can do. And you can see that there really wasn't much difference. We're looking at essentially, based on that modeling as done, about a $1.5 billion mark. And I think that fairly well conforms with what Clyde had just done. And we anticipated that would repatriate. Again, we're fairly close to his 60% mark, but we just have a higher number of about $600 million in dollars currently being spent by Massachusetts residents at casinos elsewhere. But we define elsewhere as not just in the region, but going to Atlantic City, going to Las Vegas, and elsewhere. Now, this slide shows the growth in the Northeast market is the top slide. Most of that growth is attributable to essentially the addition of new properties. We define the Massachusetts competitors in this context. Essentially, it's Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Saratoga in New York. And this is a very interesting slide. And it does show a toboggan ride for Atlantic City. And you can see the growth in eastern Pennsylvania. And while they do conform with each other, it's not necessarily one is rising at the expense of another. That is a critical factor. It also reflects to a great degree the impacts of this major recession over the last several years, which probably accounted for, in the studies we've done, about half of the decline in Atlantic City. The other half of the decline was for gambling in other communities, mostly eastern Pennsylvania, but increasingly New York and in other markets. aside from the economic projections, the 2008 report that we did for the Commonwealth, there's several themes that I think are just as valid as we sit here today as they were in 2008. Public policy, the goal, one of the critical goals of public policy should be to maximize the capital investment in those facilities. And two, that a robust, comprehensive bidding process be established. And that is essential. Not every state does that. And we think that that's an essential step in the process toward making sure that casinos work in the public interest as much as possible. We also noted in that report, and that is certainly true today, that when you're granting a fixed number of licenses, you're essentially telling these private industries that we will give you a regional monopoly. And to quote that report, when you give someone a regional monopoly, they have a concomitant responsibility to make sure that they are acting in the public interest. But having said that, it works best when you define and look for areas where when they're acting in the public interest, they're also acting in their own interests. In other words, they're not necessarily contradictory to each other. When an operator maximizes capital investment because they get a return on that investment, that can be structured and should be structured to working in the public interest. Now, there's several universal truths, as I term them in gaming. I've been studying gaming markets, multiple gaming markets, for 34 years now. And one of the things I've learned is that there's limited value in studying multiple gaming markets because they are all different. The political considerations are different. The competitive landscape is different. The regulations are different. The demographics are going to be different. So you have to keep that in mind. But having said that, another universal truth is that it requires a significant community commitment in every aspect, however you define that. And it does work best when there's an existing tourism infrastructure. If you look at markets like Atlantic City, for example, where there's a beach and so forth, it would work better than many of the properties in Indiana, where the infrastructure is abandoned steel mills. Inevitably, it fosters unrealistic expectations in both directions. People don't know what to expect, so consequently what they tend to expect often tends to be unrealistic. It could be unrealistically optimistic, it could be unrealistically pessimistic, but quite often they're unrealistic. Another important point is that the impacts of gaming, particularly if it's successful, if it meets your goals and it's operating efficiently, by definition, the impacts are going to extend far beyond the immediate area, far beyond the host communities, and that is often overlooked. So what's the formula for success? Again, effective regulation, planning, free market forces, and keeping your expectations realistic. Effective, and I want to point out this slide is probably, I've been using this for about 15 years now, 15 plus years now, long before Massachusetts was even seriously contemplating casinos. And I will state that I think the process that's unfolding in Massachusetts clearly does reflect this. I don't say that because they're our client, I say that because it's the truth, that there is a sharp and unwavering focus on integrity. Everything else stems from that. The confidence that the capital markets, the confidence that the gaming public has in this industry requires that. You start strict, and over time, as you gain confidence, you can peel away regulations. It doesn't work very well in the opposite direction. So the challenge to the public sector in general, you can set rules that encourage investment by maximizing the potential return. You can set rules that protect existing small businesses. You can set the tax rate at the highest possible level, but there's no way you can do them all. And I think that's clearly a lesson that Massachusetts has learned, because the tax rate, if you look at how tax rates have trended over the years in multiple states, they've gotten that message, and the tax rate here is much more conducive to effective capital investment, effective levels of capital investment. So you have to establish your priorities. So again, gaming has to be part of a tourism infrastructure. it should work in tandem with other businesses, not because that's good public policy, which it is, but also because it's good business. Whatever those other industries might be they restaurants, be they hotels, be they other facilities dependent on conventions and meetings and other spending in discretionary income. And it requires effectively proper planning, because gaming should serve as a catalyst for tourism. And that, I'm not focused here on so much on saturation, but clearly there's two ways that you can effectively deal with saturation, and I think this complements what Clyde said. One is that you want a business model that goes beyond the core gaming-centric customer, because in addition to looking at slot machines per population, you have to look at the type of facilities that host these slot machines. The core gaming-centric population maybe represents about 20% of the adults in any given area. And when you put more capital investment in, you can go beyond that 20% to the 80%. And you also, one way to deal with saturation, or the concerns about saturation, is to endeavor as best as you can to bring in tourists and gamblers from other areas. So the unrealistic expectation is that gaming can miraculously solve everything just by legalizing it, and that government's job is finished after legalization of casinos. And we've seen this and documented this in multiple states, and we've seen it the hard way. Government's job is effectively just beginning once you legalize casinos. And the notion that an existing local population has an automatic edge, again, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you're in a community that expects or hopes to get a casino, you may say that, well, this is going to be good for me for any number of reasons. And it may very well prove to be true. Tomorrow, I decide to move into that community, and I decide I want to compete against you. I may compete against you for a job, and I may have more relevant skills. I may compete against you in business. You may be a pharmacist. You may be a law firm, a shoe store, whatever it might be. And I come in, a restaurant. I come in and I've got a better brand, better capital investment, a better business plan. You can't necessarily assume that just by being there in a community today automatically gives you an edge. That's what I mean by that. So essentially, keep the expectations realistic. By definition, if you have a successful casino, it means there's going to be traffic. You can't have it both ways. And both winners and losers will be created. You're creating a competitive situation. You're enhancing the competitiveness in multiple industries. And you have to expect that and prepare for that. And I do want to point out in closing that I am familiar with the people from Atlantic Cape Community College who are coming here to help train and plan in advance. And that is precisely what you need to do, because if you do want to give your local population an advantage, your existing local population an advantage, one critical way of doing that is to make sure that they're trained in advance for the jobs that will be created. And with that, I thank you.
So this is the little, yep, you can also just move it with your, with the arrows. With that.
Great, thank you. Good morning. My name is Carl Jenkins. First of all, I'd like to thank the Commission for inviting me to speak today. I was a co-author of the Boston Chamber of Commerce's report back in 2008. I testified several times in front of the various committees at the State House. But I haven't been asked a lot since then, and this is a great opportunity to take a look at what I had done and see how much of it still relates to what happened after going through one of the larger recessions that we've had, and do some of the assumptions still hold. And I'll get to that in a second. One of the things I want to start off with, though, is that, first of all, I am a CPA, and I'm going to let you make a determination whether that's good or bad as far as this presentation goes. But I do look at things maybe a little bit differently than others do. I did look at this, as Professor Barros pointed out, I looked at this as a business plan. The fact that it was casinos was not really the overriding issue. What the issue was in putting together any business plan can you identify and tie down as many assumptions as possible and making a set of projections? And of course, the problem with any set of projections, the minute you change any of the underlying assumptions, those projections will most likely change. So we have to keep that in mind. So a couple of things that we looked at. We looked at the demand for casino. Actually, in any business plan, you'd look at the demand for casino gaming or the business gaming. We looked at the potential gaming revenue, and in this case, when you would look at that, typically we'd be looking at it from an investor perspective. We considered the Commonwealth to be the investor. So when we're talking about potential gaming revenue, we're actually, in the end, sort of figuring out what the Commonwealth could get from that revenue. And then we did look at, to the extent possible, socioeconomic effects. Things we looked at the time, since we didn't have casinos in Massachusetts, and one of the best ways for any business to make a determination of what possible projections would be is to take a look at what other businesses like it are doing in other places. And as we just heard, the definition of similar or the same is very difficult to tie down when you're looking at different geographic regions, obviously different investment levels, different designs, different assumptions, and going into the specific location. So it is not a perfect analysis, but it's the best we can do. And what we determined in taking a look at what we consider to be comparables is that for the most part we focused on Connecticut, and there were a lot of reasons. Connecticut has similar socioeconomic factors as Massachusetts does. It has very similar average income, average home prices, average levels of education. It actually ended up, I think, as good a model as you're going to be able to get. Also, it's roughly in the same geographic region, which is obviously important. So we also did some other things. We actually did interviews with policyholders, policymakers and stakeholders. We actually did talk to quite a number of people in Massachusetts to get their take on what it would mean, both from a economic, political, and a sociological perspective. And then, of course, we put together our forecasts and projections. And again, you change any assumptions in a forecast or projection, and you're going to see a change in the end result. So sort of an obvious conclusion is that the revenue will be dependent on the specific circumstances of the particular region and the type of development. That is a huge statement. Basically what we're saying is that you're not going to be able to make a final determination of what your revenue is going to be until you make a determination about where it's going to be and what type of development it's going to be. And I think this is an assumption that what I've been reading about, a lot of people don't quite get, is that if we are changing the type of development, you can't expect the same type of revenue assumptions that any of us are talking about. And so when decisions are made about the type of development and its location, you've got to carry that out and look at the final assumptions about what the expected revenue would be from those changes. And I'll give you a couple. These are the fundamentals of the analysis. Focus on the origins of revenue. And so far what we've heard is, I think everybody's saying the same thing, which is that the destination effect, and that is bringing revenue to the region from other places that we would not have already had. This is obviously the best type of revenue that we could expect, that any investment could expect. And this is new revenue. We wouldn't have had it before. The recaps, and often this is considered to be, for example, people that are just coming from either on vacation, from out of state, out of country. The recapture effect is what we've been talking about a little bit, what we've heard about, and that is bringing current levels of spending from out of state back into Massachusetts. Now, that's obviously very good revenue too. It's revenue that's actually, it's money that's actually already being spent in other locations, and we're just simply saying we want it back here. That probably is some of the safest level of assumption because we already know that money is being spent. We can argue about what the amounts are, we can argue about what the final amounts that are going to come back are going to be, but I think it's safe to say we've got, that's a pretty high level of confidence that some of that money is going to come back to Massachusetts if we have casinos here. The third is the substitution effect, and this is the least beneficial source of revenue. This is, what this is saying is, I can go to, for example, a slot parlor, or I can go to a movie. In the end, we're not producing any new revenue. We're just simply changing where the revenue is being spent, or the money is being spent. Instead of one source of entertainment, it's now going to be at, for example, a slot parlor. That doesn't add any new, necessarily any new revenue to the economy. And that's the area that most people would have a problem with because somebody's going to suffer from that. So let's talk about destination casinos. We're hearing that all the time. People are talking about it. What does it mean? Let me tell you what it meant to me. A destination casino, the model that we were looking at is what we have in Connecticut. We're talking about golf courses, spas, restaurants, shops, lots and lots of amenities, shows, and obviously gambling. All destination casinos are not the same. If we start changing the model about what a destination casino is going to look like, for example, it's not going to have a large hotel. It's not going to have golf. It's not going to have many of the amenities that we're looking at in Connecticut. Then it's not the same destination casino that we were thinking about when we did our report. And if it's not the same type of destination casino, then our assumptions regarding potential revenue are going to change. We talked about 3 destination casinos in different regions, and we also did not consider tribal casinos. And I think we're hearing that others did not consider the impact of tribal casinos, and part of that is because we wouldn't have the information from the tribal casinos. We don't know where they're going to be. We don't know their sizes. They don't have to necessarily be as communicative as other investors might be in their own types of casinos. So even in Connecticut, the sources of tribal revenue are not necessarily publicized. So it's very difficult to determine what the impact would be on the tribal casinos. Other than that, there's going to potentially be more than 3. We also did not include the slot parlor, which is the category 2. We just considered the 3 destination casinos. From my perspective, the slot parlor, it probably has the greatest propensity to come up with the substitution revenue. In other words, instead of going here, we're going to go to a slot parlor. One of the slot parlors do exist in Rhode Island. They are somewhat standalone. They are not considered to be destination casinos, and we actually have some. We can use some of that as modeling. And the concern that I have, of course, is if you put a slot parlor anywhere near a destination casino, we're actually going to be competing against ourselves to some degree. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. One of the things that I looked at to see what has changed in the report, I'm very happy to see that some of the major assumptions actually are still very supportable. One of the things that we looked at was what Massachusetts residents were spending in Connecticut, Maine, and Rhode Island back in 2008, and it was roughly $800 million. Current reports put it at over $900 million. So even though we went through a recession, we're actually seeing even more spending from Massachusetts residents at out-of-state casinos. On the other side of the coin, our report assumed that there was going to be an initial license fee of $200 million. And it's important to note that the initial license fee, it doesn't mean that is going to be the final license fee, but the actual, we're looking now at $85 million for Category 1 and $25 for Category 2. Now, obviously, that's less than the $200 million that we had put in the report, but it doesn't mean that that's going to be the final number. On the other hand, there was significant debate about asking for too much money as an initial fee, because that would put pressure, along with the gaming tax, on possibly making it more difficult for owners to put capital improvements back into their facilities, to expand them when needed, to keep them updated, and so forth. Obviously, the more money that goes out, the less money is available for reinvestment. Which brings us to another point which is that when we're looking at locations for casinos, I don't think anybody would assume that the day the casino opens that it's going to meet its ultimate revenue goals, and that there needs to be some consideration for both capital improvements and expansion. And I would argue that depending upon where they go, room for expansion should be considered, or else potentially we're going to put a cap on the revenue that could be earned at any given location. The gaming tax, we had assumed 27%. We see that it's a little lower for the Category 1, which is the destination, and there's 40% for Category 2, which is the slot. I don't see that as a huge problem. That actually, that 25% puts us somewhere right in the middle of sort of the reasonable area nationwide as far as what gaming taxes look like. The argument is, again, if the gaming tax is too high, there's less money available for reinvestment. It goes without saying that the combination of the gaming tax and the estimated revenue from gross gaming revenues from the casinos is the basis by which the Commonwealth is going to make a determination on how much they are going to get on an annual basis. The projected revenue, I'm sticking by my number. I used a number of 2.15 billion based on what I heard from actually the two gentlemen before me. I think not only it falls right between the two of them, and it certainly I don't see any reason why it's going to be significantly different. It may be a little less, it may be a little more, but I think we can agree that it is somewhere in that range, and that is certainly a market big enough to be able to make an attempt to capture some of it for the benefit of the Commonwealth and the citizens. One of the things that we looked at was employment, and we hear a lot about that, and the only thing I've got to go by and what the real numbers are what could be is what the proposal was for the Revere Casino, and their estimates were 4,000 for the casino and 2,500 for construction jobs. Now, at first glance, I was like, "Ooh, boy, that's way off from what we had estimated." On the other hand, we were estimating $1 billion investment in the first casino, and I believe the estimate is $500 million. So the actual investment is somewhat less than we had anticipated it would be, and if it's less, the assumption is going to be it's going to take less people to build it, and it's going to be a smaller facility, so there'll be less people working there. And actually, when I did the math, it works out, that's actually almost exactly using the same estimates that I did. It's just a smaller entity. And then finally, we tried to look at as many of the social impacts as we could. It's sort of a moot point at this point because the law is passed, and I think we heard it before. There are going to be problems and there are going to be benefits. I think in any of these considerations, the effort is going to be into just making the problems as minimal as possible and addressing them, and that's what I believe there's a lot of the law includes. So, oh, that's me, and that's it. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'd like to thank the Commission for the opportunity of being part of this panel. Going forth, you always worry if your presentation is going to come up and be materially different from the other three presentations, but you'll see our numbers and the process we took was a little bit different, but our numbers, both in terms of potential revenue and job creation, are very consistent with some of the other studies that you've heard this morning. A little bit, my name is Steve Zapor. I'm president of the Innovation Group. We're actually a group of companies that include a full-scale investment bank called Innovation Capital, a construction management company, Innovation Project Development, and we do a variety of work for governments, public and private companies, financial institutions in the gaming and resort industries. I want to talk a little bit about our engagement and compare that to what the final bill and show a little bit similarities and differences. But we were engaged by the Massachusetts Senate in 2002 to evaluate the opportunity here in Massachusetts. And really our scope of work included a couple things. Evaluate statewide revenue estimates under 7 different scenarios. And again, the modeling process we took was very consistent with some of the other processes you've heard here. Excuse me. But we were also engaged to take a look at the tax and regulatory review really from the perspective of tax structures and what type of upfront fees and tax structures might be appropriate to attract the kind of capital to build destination type of resorts. And then to do a limited economic impact analysis. And really that was focused on direct and indirect job creation, the fiscal impacts of proposed licensing fees and gaming taxes, as I mentioned. And lastly, an evaluation of the potential impact that gaming might have on the Massachusetts lottery. Obviously, the Commonwealth has a very successful lottery program. And so we took a look at other jurisdictions and the impact that gaming has had on their lottery component. Talk a little bit about the key assumptions that we used in our report, and so we can reflect on the actual bill and how they compare. But you know, we assume that the regional competition would continue to evolve. Yes, it is competitive and there's more opportunities here, but I think our conclusions are very consistent with what you've heard this morning, that there still is unfulfilled demand up here in New England, given the amount of population. But we assume that Aqueduct would be opened, Oxford, Maine would open, and that actually table games would be introduced in Rhode Island. We also assume that the economy would slowly recover through the projection period. And I think one of the most important aspects was that tax rates established are conducive to attracting capital investment for gaming facilities. And so therefore we used a flat 27% tax rate and basically a 32% overall effective tax rate when you take into account levies to fund other programs. And so I think, as Mr. Pollack said before, you know, basically a 30 to 32% effective tax rate is a lot lower than some other recent states have implemented, but it really is important to be able to provide potential developers and operators the appropriate return and to therefore set tax rates that can attract the capital they need. We also suggested upfront license fees or assumed upfront license fees of $75 million with $50 million for a Western Massachusetts license. And again, this was based upon the revenue forecast we came up with and really the impact on the development cost and the ability to raise capital again. You know, those upfront fees go into the overall cost of the projects and financing sources are going to look at them as the cost of the project. We also assumed smoking would be allowed on 25% of the casino floor. I think our firm differs a little bit with one of the other conclusions made here this morning that a totally non-smoking casino, that there will be some impact, although we don't think it'll be, we think that impact would be modest. But given the fact that you have competitors in the region that do offer that, there would be some impact. We also assume that there would be only one destination resort license per region. I think, again, this reduces the competitive risk and encourages investment. And in terms of, since we did not have specific sites in mind or sites were developed, we had developed a range of estimates for each scenario we did. And we did that by selecting plausible locations. And there were no specific locations in mind. We just picked geographic areas that we thought were at reasonable access to interchanges and things of that nature and came up with a low and high range. And again, I think our sources of visitation and revenues are consistent with what you've heard here today. You know, we took a look at the local market, both what would be induced by new casino gaming here in Massachusetts, but then also what would be recaptured from surrounding states, and then again the tourist market. One of the assumptions we made that facilities would be open by January of 2014, but really the first stabilized year would be 2016. And I think of the 7 scenarios we analyzed, and again, the different scenarios were based upon number of licenses, would tracks have slots or not. We did have actually a couple of scenarios that were very close to what the bill came out to be, and that was our scenario 4A and 5B, which was one destination resort in each of the 3 regions, and then a number of slots at a couple of different tracks. So our scenarios did not exactly line up to what was eventually passed, but it came very close. And I think from a gaming revenue perspective, you can see we came up with a low range, again, low range being, you know, a location that is not very conducive or top of the line, I guess you can say, to about 2.1 billion, again, assuming an optimal location for those destination resorts. We also came up with total direct and indirect job creation of between 16,000 and 20,000, again, pretty consistent with what you've heard here this morning. I think we, again, comparing our engagement and our outcome to the final bill, I think the key aspects regarding effective tax rate, the geographical regions, and the limits and license were generally consistent. Competition in the region continues to evolve as expected. New Hampshire is a wild card. We know that there's been a lot of iGaming initiatives out there. We don't believe that that impacts this situation here as iGamers and social gamers generally will be additive, we think, to the process. So I don't think that impacts our conclusions here. The industry overall continues to rebound. I think given the delay in what our report assumed, the facilities are not likely to be open by 2014, although I think that doesn't skew our numbers, it just pushes it out a year. And then obviously what came out of the bill was a Class 2 RFP process and potential location. Yes, that could impact destination resort applications and scope of plan that serves the planned projects, depends on where that is. You know, I think the financing market specifically will view that slot track while having a limited number of licenses. They're going to look at other jurisdictions and said that's only a start. You know, slots at racetracks have grown to expanded, they've grown to table games, and so I think where that license is put could have some potential impact on the other destination resorts and the applicants for that, given that consideration. I know this is part of the next panel, but we were asked to give our general thoughts on this, and that is how should the Massachusetts Gaming Commission prepare for the next steps? And I think, you know, you've heard it this morning, the commission's going to have a need to develop the appropriate resources to evaluate the candidates and award licenses. I mean, there's plenty of benchmarks and best practices out there in the industry to ensure a strict yet efficient system for a reasonable turnaround in license applications. I think the commission is going to have to evaluate building an in-house infrastructure or using third-party industry to support, because they're going to need expertise in construction, expertise in operations, financing, traffic, and as well as economic analysis to really evaluate these situations. The RFP process is important. I think it's the right information needs to be requested and needs to be fair and comprehensive. The commission is going to have to evaluate market assessments. You know, are the revenue assumptions and estimates that they're providing achievable and based upon reasonable assumptions? You've heard four different firms here give our thoughts on the marketplace and assumptions, and the commission is going to have to evaluate all of the candidates' responses, specifically regarding location. And their suggestions and the presence of competing facilities. Are the operating cost estimates that they're assuming in line with industry standards and dynamics of the market? And that comes down to everything like wages and benefits. Excuse me. Economic impact analyses, are their input-output models sound? You know, you have to evaluate direct and indirect employment. Both during construction and ongoing operations. I'm going to run through these quickly because my voice is giving out. Municipal local impact and the substitution effect, you've heard some of that. Traffic studies and impacts. Social impacts. You know, crime, how are you going to evaluate that as well as the problem gaming initiatives? Are they going to put programs in place to lessen the impact? Really, I think one of the thoughts right now is for the commission is to establish those baselines today so that they can evaluate going forward what those impacts would be, agree on the formulas, the models, and the process to ensure good data comparison so you can really evaluate the impact of this going forward. Environmental impacts. I think on the development and construction side, this is very important. We've seen in the industry where a lot of projects have gotten themselves into trouble by being over budget or timelines for construction being unrealistic. So the Commission's going to have to evaluate whether the described projects can be delivered within the proposed budgets, and can they be delivered in the timelines. On the financing side, being able to evaluate the financial strength, of these applicants, their balance sheet, more importantly, their ability to raise funds in today's marketplace, based upon either their financing history or their capital structure. And then is the equity capital commitment available, and the debt financing sources and assumptions that they use in their applications, are they reasonable and achievable in today's marketplace? And then finally, I think management and marketing plan. Most of the people who are applying, I assume, are going to have experience in operating casinos, but really do their marketing plans articulate a sound strategy that is predicated upon creating a destination resort and not just marketing to the local market, but being able to attract tourists and conferences and attendees from outside the area. And finally, do the plans adequately describe the cross-marketing efforts with lottery and tourism that the bill prescribes. So again, there's going to be a lot of issues that the Commission is going to have to evaluate in this process, and a lot of resources that they're going to need to apply against it. And that's it. I apologize for my voice just running right out there at the end. But
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. We're going to take a few questions. Oops, get your notes. I'm just going to take a moment to highlight while the Commission members get their thoughts together about questions that they might have, just to feedback what I think we heard. Economists, and I'm not really trained as an economist, though I pretend to be one sometimes, tend to think in these very complicated ways. But really what we're hearing is very simple, and that is that, and you can trace it back to the map that Professor Barrow put, which I'm trying to find but cannot now, showing no casinos within the boundaries of Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, being a blank hole. And that there's a market there, and it's critically dependent on three factors. One, your ability to bring people back into your communities to gamble. Two, increasing the propensity of gambling for those people in your communities. Three, minimizing the substitution effect. And four, bringing people from outside our existing concept of the market here into Massachusetts. At a very simple level, that's how each of these individuals and how we've, in my own work, defined markets. And so as the Commission looks at markets, those are the critical assumptions that they're going to have to evaluate going forward, I think. Do you have specific questions that you'd like to raise, or I'll ask one first. What strikes me about the work that you've all done is that it hasn't changed so much from 2008, but there are a lot of actors and changes which could occur which would materially impact concepts of market. Number one, it's probably difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which Connecticut does not respond to an expansion in Massachusetts. It's difficult for me to imagine that New Hampshire will not try and respond in a situation in which Massachusetts creates something in the northeastern part of Massachusetts. Could you respond to how that might affect your understanding of markets for Massachusetts? Please, yeah, jump in, anyone.
I'll start. We're happy to note that we were the lowest in the estimates, which is means we're doing our job correctly. We try to be conservative.
I don't think that.
Any adjustments for inflation, the others, but there
Mike's not on.
was
Michael.
no.
There's an on and a on and power.
How's that? Okay, good. Again, that we were the lowest in the estimates, which I take as a point of pride, that you try to be conservative, but it would be foolhardy not to take into account the possibilities. We don't know what they're going to be, but you have to assume the possibilities of expansion elsewhere, and it's simply not good public policy from a public sector or a private sector to have your fingers crossed and say, I hope they don't expand elsewhere, or that I hope they don't respond. But the best way to respond, the best way to anticipate, is to compete on the basis of the quality of the facility and the quality of the amenities, rather than competing on who's got the cheapest buffet and things like that. Because to get to your point, Steve, that the best way to deal with the potential of a saturation effect and the best way to deal with substitution and all the other issues you've raised is to focus on the benefits of the destination model, which does attract a broader demographic. It's more likely to attract visitors from elsewhere. It's more likely to withstand competition from elsewhere.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I would concur with that comment, especially because you have an opportunity to attract tourists from outside the area. Our actual report did assume that, for example, the Connecticut casinos would be more aggressive in their marketing efforts, and so we took that into account in our modeling process. They already have databases. They already have people embedded in their programs from up here, and we made the assumption that they would continue to be aggressive there. So I think our numbers took into account at least that aspect of the competition reaction.
Yeah, I'll agree with both of those points, but I would be a little bit more sanguine in terms of the politics of this. One is I don't see how Connecticut can respond. They have compacts with 2 Indian tribes, and if they were to authorize commercial facilities of any kind, those compacts are nullified. That's what happened in New York, and all of a sudden the 25% of slot revenue disappears. They don't have to pay it anymore, which is exactly what happened in New York. So I don't think Connecticut has a response. Rhode Island, of course, has on its ballot initiative the prospect of table games at both of its facilities. What most people are missing is that for those referenda to pass, they don't have to just pass at the state level. They have to pass in each of the towns where those facilities are located, and I don't think they will pass in either of those communities. And then the debate in Maine at this point is about comprehensive legislation that would limit the number of facilities in Maine, possibly not to the only 2, but I think if any others are added, it's going to be more towards the Canadian border to catch some of the traffic going back and forth there. So I think Massachusetts is positioned not only demographically but politically in a very favorable position. And if they compete on quality, they will compete successfully.
Going last, of course, I'm going to agree with everything that was just said. I also want to point out that there are certain things that Connecticut can't change. It can't change its geography. It can't change its location in southern New England, and Maine, for that matter, can't change its location. It's given the fact that it's in northern New England. Neither one of them have the attraction that both that Massachusetts has as both a population center and an economic center, already a tourist destination. I mean, I forgot what the number was, but we have something like I don't know, 5-6 times the number of people coming into Massachusetts than the next New England state already. So I'm not so sure what either Connecticut or Maine, for example, can do that is going to change some of those basic geographic and economic conditions.
Commissioner?
I'm sure we all have a lot of questions. I'll start, and then we'll just take turns. Professor Barrow, you talked about a lot about the percent of disposable income that is put into casino gambling. I gather that does not include the percent of disposable income that goes into the lottery. Is that right?
That's correct.
So, although we're very low at a percent of disposable income in casino gambling, we're probably very, very high if you added in the lottery percent. How does that cut? I know each of you have talked about the lottery to a certain extent, but as I've read the various reports, nobody has really talked about what a huge penetration rate we have here with our lottery and how that might be affected. So maybe starting with you, since you relied on that so much.
Depending on the year, Massachusetts residents spend about $1 billion per year on casino gambling in other states, not counting Las Vegas. they spend about $1 billion a year on the lottery. So those two combined, they're spending about 1% of their disposable income on those two forms of gambling.
They spend about $4.6 billion on the
Well, those are sales, but in terms of the
mean
amount that
gross?
actually is kept by the state, that would be the equivalent of gross gaming revenues in terms of the lottery. So it's about equal amount that is lost by the players. So it's about equal. We have a penetration rate of about 54%. You know, we do this survey every 2 years where we ask people what games they play and how often. About 54% of residents play the lottery right now in some form, whether scratch tickets or lotto games. But what we've also found is that casino players are also lottery players. They're not substituting one form of gaming for the other. Now, there'll probably be some substitution as a consequence of moving casinos into Massachusetts. We've twice before done studies looking at what happened in states with mature lotteries after casino gaming was introduced, and frankly, it's a mixed bag. You get every possible scenario imaginable. In places like Connecticut and New Jersey, the lottery has been very robust and it's continued to grow after the introduction of casino gambling. In some states, you've seen the rate of growth slow down, but it still grew. In others, you've seen it decline temporarily for 2 or 3 years, and then it rebounds back to its previous growth rates. So I think most people are estimating you'll see some impact on the lottery, possibly 8%, but that's why the legislature, in its wisdom, allocated a share of the gaming taxes to the local aid fund to ensure that towns and cities don't suffer a reduction in revenues.
Just to clarify one thing, so you're more or less $1 billion that goes to Connecticut. That's gross gaming revenue. That's
Right.
not gambled dollars.
Right.
Okay.
Right. The handle would be about 9 times bigger than that. It'd be more like 9 billion, which would be the equivalent of lottery sales.
In our 2008 report, we were charged with dealing among a number of issues, specifically with the potential impact on the lottery. And I also want to point out Doug Walker, who's on our next panel, and I worked on that section of the 2008 report. And two of the principal findings, and it certainly echoed what Clyde said, and that the lottery and casinos are different experiences, but there are opportunities in states, and what we've seen in states that have both, is that if handled correctly, that the lotteries can continue to grow even with casinos in the same state. And one of the things that we suggested in that 2008 report was that one of the issues that bidders and ultimately licensees have to deal with here is what plans do they have to work with the lottery. What we've seen in other states is that casinos tend, as lottery agents, casinos are often lottery agents in the states in which they operate, and often, to no one's surprise, are often among the most productive and biggest sellers for lotteries in those states. They have them near the parking garages and so forth. But what we suggested is that using some creativity to find joint marketing efforts, joint opportunities for which they can work together to actually enhance sales, so you can actually potentially, through the right system, with some creativity, actually increase lottery sales to many of the out-of-state customers who are coming to Massachusetts. One of the things we saw in Connecticut, we did a study in Connecticut in 2009, and that the lottery viewed casinos solely as competition and not as a potential complementary partner. We saw that as a lost opportunity, that if they were able to figure out ways to work together, because if people are going to come to Connecticut in that case to gamble, they're more likely to go to the two casinos from out of state than they are to buy a lottery ticket, which represented an opportunity. In our view, the fact that they viewed themselves solely as competition and did not explore the potential for complementary relationships, it was a lost opportunity.
Can I make one correction? I misspoke on one thing, which is that Massachusetts residents are actually right now spending about 0.5% of their disposable income on the lottery and casinos combined. By spending, I mean losing.
And I would just add to that comment, the last slide I had was when these applicants put forth their responses and their applications and their marketing plans, will they have suggestions, will they have plans in there for working with the lottery to grow that, as Mr. Pollack said. You know, it hasn't been done all that great in the business before, but there's a real opportunity here, and they could bring some real creative minds, you know, together working with the lottery to help mitigate that impact. So the onus, I think, will be on applicants to put forward some of their plans with that regard.
I don't know. Is this on? Can you hear this? Yep. Yeah, okay. It's your voice. We actually did look at, in our 2008 study, we actually did account for the effects on, possible effects on the lottery. And one of the things that we noticed is in states that did bring gambling and that did have a lottery is, without a doubt, there was an initial decrease in lottery spending. And I think that's exactly why there is mitigation built into the law. However, the other thing that we saw was that over time, lottery spending actually did go back up. And so I think the lesson is, I don't think anybody's saying that we're not going to see a possible drop in lottery spending in the beginning, but I do think that with some of the things that we're hearing today and others, that the lottery spending does come back.
I had a quick question regarding, in the legislation, we are able to set the licensing fee. There's a bare minimum for both the resort destination casino as well as the slots parlor. Is there, you know, what would make economic sense? What should the commission possibly consider based on region or what have you as to what that license fee be?
Can I go first this time?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, license fee is one of my favorite issues. One of the things you have to look at a license fee at, it's got to be obviously customized in each case, but you have to look at a license fee the way an investor would look at a license fee. And when they're calculating return on invested capital, that goes into the denominator. I'll give you, so you've got to be very careful, because if the license fee is set too high, you can force them into a different, less than optimal business model. And so one of the things we did say in our 2008 report is be wary of any applicant that just simply comes in with the highest license fee, that you have to look at that in the broader context. Just a quick hypothetical example. If a developer is going to build a property and says he's going to invest $1 billion and thinks that can generate $200 million in EBITDA, and he has an investment threshold of a 20% return, he's right there. But if he adds in a $100 million license fee, his investment now goes to $1.1 billion. His investment, the return now drops below that 20%. So say the response is then, well, now I'm only going to invest $800 million and add a $100 million license fee, so total investment is $900 million, but the expected EBITDA is going to drop to $180 million. I'm at the 20% threshold, but that $20 million delta between those two scenarios translates into lower tax revenue, lower employment, perhaps a different business model. So I'm suggesting that it has to be done very carefully, and there's not going to be one number that's going to be right for everyone.
I think you said it all.
Thank you, by the way, very interesting discussion. I had a question about, and you all seem to touch on this, the fact that the way to be competitive is to pay attention to the amenities themselves. And I'm wondering if, you know, the Revel model in New Jersey, where they really went very high-end with other amenities, is it too soon to evaluate the effect there? And is that what you were referring to when you said that's a way to make sure you're going to be competitive in the market?
I'll go first this time. First of all, I think it is too soon, but what I was referring to in my report was focusing on Connecticut, first of all. In fact, in a number of analysis that we did, we actually carved out Atlantic City from some of our comps, because it is different enough that you don't want to. We didn't want to be basing our forecasts on what Atlantic City was doing. It's sort of a standout. It's almost like Las Vegas, in our opinion. So as a result, what we were talking about for amenities, I think we're talking about what you're seeing in Connecticut. Not the least of which are the concert venues, the golf, all the things. If you go on the website and look, actually they have listed amenities. You could actually take a look at that. So from my perspective, anything different from that could actually change the ultimate result. And one other thing is that. Many of those amenities, if you're going to north central Connecticut, it's safe to assume very few of those amenities existed before those were built. That's not necessarily true for example, in eastern Massachusetts. Many of those amenities are there, whether it's golf, whether it's concert venues, restaurants, and so on. So that's an additional challenge for you. It's not just simply putting those in, it's also making sure that we're not substituting, a concert venue in Boston with a concert venue nearby. So I think that's another challenge that you're going to have in that regard.
And I think you're right, because you have to balance. You want to create enough amenities to attract out-of-state tourists, people from other regions, or else you're just going to end up with some local casinos, which is not what you want. But as the gentleman was saying, there's a fine balance between creating too many and impacting the local communities. But I think you can do that on a balanced basis. But I think it's important to create these destination resorts, which include food and beverage, entertainment, retail, whatever they might be, because the purpose of this is just not to give people in Massachusetts a local opportunity to gamble. It's to really reach out and bring other people in. And that's what draws them.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, we've got another few minutes before we're supposed to get on to the next schedule. You want to continue on asking questions? Continue on? A couple of questions? Great. Agreed. Okay.
I have a question relative to the no smoking assumption, or rather restriction. And I'd be interested in Professor Barrow's argument that that would be a positive, because I had read that it would be some negative impact.
I may be in the minority on this particular issue, and I know I've taken a lot of flack for it, and I first got interested in it when I was asked by the American Lung Association to do a survey on casinos and smoking in the state of Illinois, which was one of the states that went to a smoking ban in 2008. What our survey research shows is, obviously we know that the vast majority of residents across the United States don't smoke anymore. 77% of New Englanders are non-smokers, and that number's going down. The number of non-smokers is going up. The number of smokers is going down on a consistent basis. So that's one issue. What we found was, of course, non-smokers prefer a non-smoking environment. We found that smokers do not gamble with any greater frequency than non-smokers, contrary to the conventional wisdom in the industry. And we found that even about a third of smokers say they prefer a non-smoking environment in terms of the casino. And I could go through a whole litany of other observations that I've noticed at various casinos around the country in terms of how they structure their gaming floors between smoking and non-smoking areas, where the non-smoking is to be marginalized. It's the machines nobody wants to play. It's lower minimums. So they almost generate the illusion that smokers gamble more and spend more, because they force non-smokers into the smoking area. So I think this is going to be an interesting experiment, but I think Massachusetts will benefit from this. And there is a growing trend around the country. There are a couple organizations now to promote non-smoking in casinos. Employee groups are promoting it just like they did in the airline industry a couple of decades ago. The Revel, 100% non-smoking. We'll see if that holds. And there are a lot of Indian casinos that are going that way to protect their tribal members who work there at this point. So I think in the end we're going to find out. It's going to be an interesting experiment, but I think Massachusetts will benefit from it.
I wanted to come back to the destination resort piece that we've been talking about, because Mr. Pollack, you used in one of your charts, and I think in the first one, a 2-hour drive time as the draw for people. And then we've talked about the amenities that need to exist in a destination resort. And so I have a couple of questions on this score. Is the 2-hour drive time consistent with the notion that what we're looking for is a destination resort?
Yeah, when you're talking about a convenience model with a higher tax rate, say the Class 2 facility, it's not going to draw from a 2-hour drive time. It's going to draw much closer. A 2-hour drive time is reasonable if you look at Atlantic City as a model, or Connecticut. It essentially draws perhaps from a 3-hour drive time, but what you're drawing for that third hour is simply not as much. So I think it's reasonable to have. You're going to have the level of amenities that are going to prompt a material number of people within that drive time to come to the facility. I wouldn't feel comfortable going much beyond that. I think that's a reasonable expectation for what we anticipate being built.
Now focusing for a second on the amenities, is it possible for a casino to capitalize and derive synergy from existing amenities and still meet the kinds of projections you're talking about? You, Mr. Pollock, Mr. Jenkins, talked about the existing amenities in certain areas that are there.
Exactly, and that's exactly what I was talking about. Massachusetts is great to have. If we just focus on golf, I mean, golf in any of the areas that we're looking at there, well, actually more in the southeastern and western areas, but certainly some of the best golf courses around are already there. Could some sort of relationship be made between the casino and the golf courses to encourage an opportunity to play at those? We have just the natural effects, attractions, whether it's on the southeast coast. Obviously there's the Cape, there's the southeast coast. Out west we have the Berkshires and Tanglewood, and there's so many opportunities to take advantage of some of these amenities that already exist. It's not necessarily that you've got to start from scratch or build them as part of the construction of the casino, but find a way to take advantage of what's already there. That's one of the reasons why Massachusetts is different than Connecticut, because many of those attractions are what are bringing people here already. And if there is an opportunity to also gamble at a casino, not only are you going to get the gambling, but you're also going to get the other attractions that are going to already draw people that are now potentially going to go gambling, and vice versa. So I think that's why it's not just looking at what Maine is going to do to their casinos, or what, whether Connecticut's going to expand again. I'm not sure that that's going to really make any difference. What will make the difference is taking advantage of what we already have here. And that's a terrific opportunity, and I think that's something that should be part of the proposal process. What is the suggested ideas to take advantage of what is already around? And that does two things. One, it makes the casino more attractive, and two, it actually does encourage casino visitors to use the local market, which is what I think everybody would hope to occur.
And finally, thank you. Finally, in your talk, Mr. Pollock, you were talking about the importance of a competitive bidding process for realizing some of the assumptions your report contained. Can you expand on that a little bit, and what happens if there isn't a competitive bidding process for one reason or another?
You mean in a process where the licenses are fixed? Ohio would be a great example of that. There was no competitive bidding process there.
Or if there's a competitive bidding process, but there is no competition for a particular license.
That has happened as well. Maryland was a good example of that. I don't anticipate that's likely to happen here, but I do expect that there are ways to potentially address that. It doesn't mean necessarily that if you only have one bidder for any given license, that by nature you just have to grant that license. We made It was one of our recommendations in that 2008 report. If it doesn't meet what you think is best equipped to advance public policy, there's no. We did recommend that you don't have to grant that license, but by its very nature, the competitive bidding process forces, if structured correctly, forces applicants to really be as creative as possible, to suggest the highest level of investment as possible, the greatest employment. It incents them to work with local businesses and the various other areas that are required. So it's, all things being equal, it's the best way to advance public policy. I don't anticipate that you're going to be facing the same problems as Maryland had. They faced it largely because they came in with a 67% tax rate. They initially had 4 bidders for 5 licenses.
Commissioner Stebbins, who's been orchestrating this event, said we could run over a little bit. I hope our next panelists will just sit tight, because I think this is such a good opportunity. We hate to lose any of it. Mr. Zapor, I think it was your innovation group, maybe all the reports did, but you talked at one point about sequencing the licenses so that a loser in one site would have an opportunity to bid again in a subsequent site. Is that, A, how plausible is that? And haven't they already picked out the site that they think is the optimal site for themselves? And B, does anybody have any experience to see whether that really works as a way to promote competition?
Well, we did not cover that in our report. So maybe it was one of the other, maybe it was Michael Pollack. So I'll hand that over to him then.
Well, there was essentially one reason why we cited in the report why that would make sense, because if you have all your best companies and best potential operators bidding for the same license, it allows them a second bite at the apple, so they can essentially try something else. Another advantage of that, by the way, which we did not put in our 2008 report, but which makes sense, is that depending, if you do it sequentially, depending on where the first license is issued geographically and who it's issued to, will allow subsequent bidders to adapt and help maybe change their bids to reflect that, so it works in the best interest of the Commonwealth. In terms of the question as to whether or not it's been tried elsewhere, to my knowledge, no. Not the ones that I've been involved with that I can think of. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea, but I think they've.
So it's theoretically attractive, but you don't really know for sure what effect it would have.
Correct.
Right, okay. Another question on the slots. Several people have made allusions, or one or more people have made allusions to having a negative impact on the value of a casino license if a slots parlor is nearby. I wonder if there's any other evidence or advice about where this slots parlor should go. Is it a consensus that having a slots parlor nearby is a negative, first? And second, is there any proactive advice, you know the lay of the land that we're dealing with, where a slots parlor would optimally go?
Well, I think it has, you've heard it here today that a slot parlor is not necessarily going to attract people from further away. It's not necessarily going to be a tourist destination. So I think you're going to look to locate it in an area that has the ability to recapture as many dollars going out of the state from existing Massachusetts residents. And yes, I think I was one of the people who voiced the concern that if that license is located at close proximity to one of the destination locations, that it could give some fear to the financing community that potential expansion of that slot license could impair the destination. So I think you have to take a look at geographically where that might be. I think the process allows for that license to be first in the sequential process, and so from there I think it'll allow the other applicants to follow through. But it's going to be something that needs to be carefully considered. But again, it's not a facility that could be conducive to attracting tourists. So I think the location has to be focused on repatriating dollars back to Massachusetts.
A question related to Chairman Crosby's first point about is there one of the regions where you think there's higher market value which would encourage them to sequence something?
Well, if I may, there is actually some evidence when you're looking at the Rhode Island slots, because I think it's something like roughly 1% of the visitors to the Rhode Island slots come from Connecticut, which is a bordering state. And it probably doesn't take much to figure out why there's so few people going to Rhode Island to play slots. It's because they don't have to. And to the extent they do, it's obviously going to come out of the Connecticut destination casinos. So apparently the Connecticut residents or players have already made a decision that there's no need to go and play slots in Rhode Island because we don't have to. So if you do, I think that's good evidence that if you were to put a slot somewhere near a destination casino, that it's going to be battling each other for the same dollar. So that begs location then, and if you're asking me, I'd put it as far away as I could from what's most likely to be my first destination casino. So whatever that might be, I would go for distance on that one.
I had a question about, in looking at where the new markets have emerged, and we were looking at Pennsylvania, we were looking at New York and Delaware, and the model in those three locations, at least in some of them, had the casino next to a racetrack. Now, I'm just wondering if any of you have had a chance to evaluate that model and how well it's working. Does one market enhance the other? I was interested in if you have had a chance to look at that.
Well, I'll touch on one aspect of that, particularly New York and Pennsylvania. It's a different model in the sense that Pennsylvania has authorized up to 14. Essentially, they were originally slot parlors. They've morphed into full-fledged casinos in the sense that they've added table games. I think only 2 of them have hotels at this point, the Sands and Mount Airy. New York is a VLT state like Rhode Island. They now have 9 facilities, including Aqueduct. If you're looking, they're taxed at a much higher rate than the Massachusetts tax rate. As a consequence, much lower levels of capital investment. You're seeing facilities invested maybe at the high end of $170 million, down well below $100 million. And the net effect of that is that they've been very effective revenue generators for the state, which is what they were intended to be, but they have not been very good economic development engines in terms of job creation. And just yesterday, I mean, they have created jobs, but the racinos tend to generate about 3 new jobs for every $1 million gambled. The resort casinos are now generating 6 to 7 new jobs for every $1 million gambled. And that's because the jobs are in the table games and the jobs are really in the non-gaming amenities, which are more labor intensive. Slot machines, as you know, are basically automated at this point to the point that it's tickets in, tickets out. You almost, other than a slot technician, there's not a lot of job creation there. So they've been effective as revenue generators, but I think not so effective job creators.
Just to add to that, if you're asking, does the addition of slot machines to a racing facility stem the decline in attendance at live racing? No. Does it increase slot play by racing fans? A little bit. Does it increase? Do the slot players migrate over to racing and play there? No. What it essentially does, it increases the pool by which they can increase and enhance their purses, which allows them a more lucrative export signal and allows them to compete against racinos elsewhere that do have better purses and consequently can secure the better horses. But it does not generate a significant material live attendance. And to be perfectly candid, and we've done this in a number of states, is that in many states, they maintain the racing element of their operations because they're required to, not because it remains a viable business model.
One question about collecting research and data. It seems from everybody's presentations there's good statewide data. I look at us having an opportunity of once a license is awarded through the construction period that we can do some good baseline research around the immediate geographic area. If you had to pick 3 or 4 things for us to assess and study and evaluate and gather data on, kind of in that local region, what would be the information you would think would be helpful to us?
Well, I have 2 or 3 thoughts on that. You might want to say the crime data, although you can go back and get that after the fact because they keep it historically. I think one interesting study that I don't think has been done is to actually make some very careful and detailed inventory of the types of local business establishments, lodging, food and beverage, retail in the area, because I know that some critics have argued that even when you see an increase of employment in those sectors, the argument is it's because local businesses get replaced by chains. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing if they pay better wages and hire people, but we could certainly answer that question. I think you're definitely going to need a baseline study of problem gambling across the state as well in those localities to see if there is in fact an increase. So to me, those are 2 of the big ones in terms of impacts on local businesses and problem gambling prevalence.
Actually, I'd look at 3 things. I'd look at employment, I would look at crime, and I'd look at property values. And I think property values are sort of the catch-all, because if there is broad economic effect, positive economic effect in a region, I think you're going to see a lot of it in the property values. Also, the other thing that we learned out of Connecticut is there are impacts in other areas that we may not see up front, but are dramatic, and that affects property values, which includes education. The number of foreign language speakers in the Connecticut schools went from something like 4 in the immediate area in Uncasville to something like 27 in a relatively short period of time. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on schools and money being spent on education. And I do think that many of these things manifest itself in property values. So that's, I focus on that.
If I may just elaborate on that, because we did a 2009 study in Connecticut, and the point, and it was a fairly extensive and arguably fairly critical study. One of the things it found is that when you look at the impact, you can't look at them in silos, because one of the things we saw that in the absence of proper planning in the areas, for example, of employment, in targeting existing areas of unemployment or underemployment, there was no policies in place to reach those people in advance. So consequently, they brought in a lot of workers from other areas, which creates demand and creates a burden on services in those other areas. We did see that in the school districts, not just in Uncasville, but in the entire region. And we saw a phenomena which I never heard of the term before when we did a study called hotbedding. I had never heard this expression. What it refers to is people who are coming in to work at these various jobs, and they take 3 shifts, and they share a bed. So you'll sleep from 12 to 8, you'll get the bed from 8 to 4, and you get the bed from 4 to 12, and consequently the bed never gets cold. So it's called hotbedding. And it's a phenomenon that was arguably could have been reduced or avoided with proper planning. So you can't look at any one of these criteria in isolation.
I think we're finished with commission questions. I just thought, Steve Norton, you have your own, we're going to hear from you in the next panel, but you have your own ideas about methodology and models and so forth, and I just wondered whether you had any questions for this panel before we adjourn it.
Well, I think we've done a great job of asking the questions. I think we can wait till the next panel.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists.